The way the numbers are coming in at the moment, I would be showing up to say, look what we told you, we were right. We all went in kind of having heard about this Gemini network since it was announced, in January 2024? And we all went in thinking, how does this work? And not really believing on it. I think after that half an hour or an hour's panel discussion, we kind of came out thinking, oh, okay, this is a logical plan. We can see how different it is, and we can understand why you believe that's enough to get to 90%. Welcome to the Freight Debate, the ultimate destination for supply chain professionals, logistic leaders, and anyone who's ever wondered what really keeps the world moving. We're back at it today, Phil. Plenty of new things to discuss and get into it and what's happening in the market these days.
Hello, Emily. Let's take a different theme maybe this week, because we've talked about conflict and tariffs and all sorts, haven't we, in previous freight debates. So let's focus on something a little bit different, and let's focus on reliability, and more specifically, the Gemini Alliance. Because to set the scene for our viewers and listeners, back in October, Kenny Scotter and Rolf Haben-Jansen from Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd joined us at the Zanetta Summit, and they shared the stage and they talked about the new Gemini Alliance and their confidence in achieving what I think a lot of people in the room thought were pretty lofty ambitions of 90% reliability. Certainly against the backdrop of generally poor reliability, been in place since February. So maybe this is a good time for us to take a little check on progress. Where are they? Where's the industry more generally? So what do you think, Emily?
Yeah, I think let's do it. We've been talking a lot about all the disruption and everything shippers are facing, and we've talked about kind of bringing good news. And I think the Gemini numbers suggest there is some to be found. But just not just for Gemini, the whole industry is seeing an improvement. It's still not brilliant. So the latest numbers we have on schedule reliability from Sea Intelligence, it's 58.7%, something like that, just so still under 60%, which is better than it has been in a while, but
Yeah,
it's still
but
pretty poor.
exactly. And can I just pick something up? Is shipping the only industry where you pay more for a generally worse service? So this, when we're talking about the reliability here, it's at a time of, well, spiking freight rates, and certainly freight rate increases since Red Sea crisis unfolded back in 23. But the same was the case during COVID. That actually, when you have disruption, I mean, disruption is going to have an impact on reliability, understandably so. But you also pay more, don't you? You pay more for a lesser service. It's quite a contradiction, isn't it?
But I mean, I would, having recent experience on the Danish train system, I would say those tickets are quite expensive, and you still end up on a bus replacement service or what you want to call it. So no, I mean for sure we've seen record high prices and record low service, and that kind of connection between. We spend a lot of time looking into kind of, is there a link between a carrier offering a better service and that costing more, whether that's on environmental performance or transit times or schedule reliability? And I think at the moment the answer is no, but we can get into that a bit more because that's kind of the next step if Gemini's promises can be held, and we'll see how
Sure.
that goes.
Okay, let's start by, can you give an overview of why was this such big news? Why have Gemini, Rolf Haben-Jansen and Kenny Scotter, why did they take to the stage at the Zanetta Summit and say, this is what we're going to do? What's the reason behind it?
I think as we've laid out, the reason behind it is that reliability has been really, really poor for a long time in container shipping. If you look sort of before the pandemic, the average was around 80%. So not brilliant, but a lot better than where it is today. Again, kind of closing up on the 60%, but still pretty poor. And I think one more thing I would add to that is, it's not just that they're arriving a little bit late. If you take all the ships that arrive late, they arrive on average 5 days late. That's huge. Of course, that then includes those that are arriving 2 days late and those that are arriving 2 weeks later. But that's a huge difference. And if you're there trying to figure out, okay, I need to get this container onto a truck or onto a rail or onto the next feeder ship, 5
Yeah.
days is a really big problem for shippers everywhere. And it
Well,
costs money to build
yeah,
that
but
buffer into your system.
exactly. But those 5 days as well, especially if we're living in a world of tariff deadlines where where 5 days can actually make the difference between paying 145% or whatever it was, 30%. 5 days is significant, isn't it?
Absolutely. So that's really where they came from. With this 90% target, again, that's better than it was pre-pandemic. So it is a very high ambition level. And to be honest, I think a lot of us internally at Zanetta as well saw this and thought, what world are they living in? If what is
Yeah.
this? Because we don't
Yeah.
see a way to get there. You can't just announce this new network and say 90% schedule reliability. It seems like a dream in a distant future that's not realistic.
But they were
Um,
confident. They were
they were
confident.
confident.
They were pushed during during their appearance at the summit, weren't they? And they were kind of. In fact, I mean, I'm not sure if they'll be listening, Kenny and Rolf, but if they are, please come back, because they said during the summit we'll come back next year and we'll talk about our performance at next year's 2025 Zanetta Summit. So
To be fair,
uh,
the way the numbers are coming in at the moment, I would be showing up to say, look what we told you, we were right.
right,
But I think
what are they then?
I was sitting with a few of our shipper customers at that session, and we all went in, kind of having heard about this Gemini network since it was announced in January 2024,
Hmm.
and we all went in thinking, how does this work, and not really believing on it. I think after that half an hour or an hour's panel discussion, we kind of came out thinking, oh, okay, this is a logical plan. We can see how different it is, and we can understand why you believe that's enough to get to 90%.
So what is it?
That was a
What's the
clear
plan?
shift in after that session to me. And
Yeah.
I've heard the same presentation, whether it's at TPM or other conferences since, and you get that same idea that actually, okay, once you've been explained to you, you can see the theory behind it.
Okay. What's the theory?
What's the theory? Easy. The theory is to go towards a hub and spoke model in a way that container shipping hasn't done yet. So typically when we talk about container shipping, we talk about the services that are set up, and carriers offer these port calls. They often have 4 or 5 on one end, 4 or 5 on the other. I mean, we were talking about it with the US port fees. If you were calling 3 ports in North America, that was going to be expensive. Gemini's idea is to go, we don't need that many direct port calls. We're going to focus on a very few hubs in the main regions, and then we're going to do a feeder network. So alliances, how they've worked in the past is you have the alliance cooperating on the main deep sea trades, but then getting the container from the main port into the smaller port, whether that's Oslo, or wherever, is the carrier basically doing that on their own. It's not part of the alliance. They might have
Mhm.
an agreement with a regional feeder service. We have plenty of those in North Europe who would then do that, but it's separate to the alliance. What Hapag and Maersk have done here is that actually those feeder shuttles are also going to be part of the alliance. So it's all going to be kind of more in the alliance, really focusing on those hub ports. And importantly, they are hub ports that either Hapag or Maersk have some form of ownership in. So it's not just like they're picking a random one and saying, we're basing all our dreams on this. It's saying this is a terminal they've invested a lot of money in this over the past few years. And we have a belief that actually, because we know that capacity, we understand how that terminal functions, we believe we can get there and out as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Could that come at the expense of other alliances trying to access those same terminals or not?
I mean, I don't think so, because they typically wouldn't call those same terminals. But in theory, yes. Every port has several terminals, and the carriers go to different places. But that is if you're letting Maersk ship in before somebody else, then that's definitely a consideration. But that's where we see in all ports today that you have certain terminals that are easier. Even when we had all that congestion in LA during the pandemic, you still had some ships who were sailing straight through because they had access to that terminal. They maybe arrived at the right time, all the rest of it. While others, and at the time it was particularly all these new shipping lines that really started of just a US company chartering in a ship and saying we need to move it. But of course they show up on the US West Coast and there's no terminal because they don't have those agreements in place.
Right.
But for Gemini, that's really, really clear. We want to do far fewer direct port calls, and then we'll feeder stuff out, but that feeder or that shuttle network is going to be integrated into our plans.
Okay. That's the theory. What's the reality? How is Gemini shaping up so far?
As you said, it was started in February, so it's not fully rolled in yet, especially for the last month we have data on, which is back in April. So we're still kind of waiting to see that come. But they are hovering around the high 80s, 90%. Clearly better than the previous alliances they were in, both 2M and the Alliance for Hapag, who were at much lower levels. They're around 40-ish%, I think, at their worst last year. So they're clearly doing better than that. But we do need to just let the system run through a little bit more so you get those kind of full numbers and everything's in place. But
Well,
clearly an
that's you.
improvement.
It's more than an improvement, isn't it?
Oh,
Really?
yep. Don't let
You
me
know?
understate things. No, it's
Yeah.
it's
I
it's
mean,
it's
you
proof that
know.
at least the theory works, and the theory works even this year when we've had so much disruption, as you talked about in the intro, right? We've just seen all this chaos, and actually
Yeah.
they're still getting to high 80s, 90%.
So, what would be the market kind of average reliability now?
So it's about just under 60% on the global level. That's where they're at globally, and this is all numbers from Sea Intelligence.
Yeah. So
Yeah. The
even would
Ocean
it take?
Alliance, if I remember correctly, the Ocean Alliance is at about 50%, whereas Gemini is getting up there in the high 80s, 90s. So
Yeah.
so that
I,
is a big difference.
it's a big difference. You know,
Yeah.
there's no denying it, is there? So what is it a case of they're just leveraging their advantage of the terminal infrastructure and ownership? And if so, that's just a competitive advantage that they have. But if there's other things to come into this hub and spoke approach, you would imagine other alliances will be looking at this and thinking this is the way to go. Or will they not?
I think
Will they, can they
maybe
not?
we've been a bit positive because, shippers went into that session and they understand how it works and they thought, okay, I can see how it's happened. But for a lot of them, there's a major question mark, and that's around the concept of transshipment. So you can say, okay, fine that the main lane ships will get there on time, but and that the direct transit time between port pairs is shorter because there are fewer port calls. But if it means I have to wait 6 days for transshipment, which is what a lot of them have experienced in the past, that doesn't necessarily help them. The fact that it gets to one of Gemini's hubs in North Europe doesn't mean it arrives in their port on time. And I think, especially over the last few years, you have a lot of shippers who've been burnt a little bit with transshipment and delays and who are still trying to figure that out. And at the moment, those reliability numbers are on those kind of main trade lanes. So
Okay.
that's kind of one of their question marks at shippers, and would make them a little bit reluctant, certainly from some of them we're seeing, reluctant in taking that jump, because that is also a major shift, and we're still waiting a little bit for it to be proved kind of when it's fully up and running, and we've had several months of data.
Right. And going back to the previous point that I made earlier around it, isn't it strange that you pay more for a worse service? Are shippers being asked now to pay more for a inverted commas better service with Gemini or not?
Simple answer, no. And this is also one of those discussions we've had with shippers, and we were looking at it when we were doing the tender analysis for the 2024 or 2025 tenders. There's not, and I think it's also on this Gemini side, they're not expecting that this suddenly means they can earn more money, because again, they really need to prove themselves. Shippers have been burnt. If you have a year where everything works according to plan and you as a shipper can see, okay, the containers I moved with Gemini got there faster and more consistently than Ocean or MSC or anybody else, then maybe you say, if I need to pay a little bit extra for Maersk and Hapag to take my containers, then maybe I do. But
Mm.
again, you need enough demand for that and enough people to believe that this service is worth paying more for before Maersk and Hapag can then say, okay, this is now a sort of a form of premium service, and we can charge more for it. But I think at the moment, I think last I checked, Far East to US West Coast rate, Hapag was the lowest. If I think the lowest, maybe one of the few lower carriers. So we're not seeing that link at the moment. But give it a year, and if shippers really can see, actually, I can save money because I'm not facing all these delays, then maybe if they are forced to pay higher because suddenly there's that demand in the market, maybe those rates push up, but not at the moment.
And other carriers would then have to react in kind, wouldn't they? You know,
Potentially. I think at the moment, a lot of there's certainly one carrier that's been very vocal in, we are sticking with the direct port calls. We believe that that is the way to get you the fastest service, even if it's a little bit delayed. You get to the right port on that direct deep sea trade rather than having to rely on transshipment. And we'll see which works out best.
and in terms of uh, the rates, the freight rates, we've seen a spike after the lowering of tariffs, for example. Um, but then, while the 145% tariffs were in place, um, we still didn't see the fall in rates that you would ordinarily anticipate with effectively pushing the stop button on trade between China and the US. Um, how would Gemini have managed to keep that reliability where it is in the light of essentially no boxes being moved? Are they not blanking? Are they not blanking sailings? How do they achieve that in such a strange circumstance?
So yeah, as on the industry level as a whole, they blanked a lot of capacity. A lot of
Mm.
capacity was removed from those trades, and that's what kept rates up. But Gemini did it differently. And I think we've spent a lot of time talking about kind of this promise of 9% reliability and reliability scores. The way they're measured these days, it's only taking the ships that sail. So great that the ship arrives on time 80% of the time. But if every third sailing is blanked because there's not the capacity for it, and you don't get on that ship, you're going to be delayed, even though that doesn't necessarily reflect in reliability numbers. So there's another thing there that actually even the 60% is a little bit high, because you should really be taking blank sailings into account, because that also hurts your schedule.
Right.
But Gemini did it differently. And I hadn't seen it coming. I hadn't seen sort of expected this, but it does sort of make sense. They didn't remove any capacity. They maybe blanked one small sailing, but that was it. What they did instead was they still removed capacity, but instead of blanking sailings, they just deployed smaller ships. So you still had that weekly service, or however often that service was meant to run. It was running, but it was running on a smaller ship, and that's how they removed some of their capacity from the market. Whereas the other alliances, MSC, went to the traditional tool of blank sailings, and that is, in theory, that works both when the market is falling and you want to remove capacity, and when there's a lot of demand and you want to add capacity and move more containers. That you can, because you've got this direct port to port hub, you can really match the size of the ship to what the demand is and manage your capacity that way without coming with those kind of disruption that is a blank sailing. Um,
Yeah.
that requires some flexibility in your fleet. So that's another aspect. How many ships do you have ready to go, and then you can decide this week if we send the small, the medium, or the big ship.
Right, yeah, exactly. You
That
can't just pick up a ship and say, "I'm gonna put it on the Trans-Pacific instead of, South America, East Coast or whatever." You know what I mean? It's like, you
it's
can't
not
just do
quite
that,
that
can you?
simple.
No.
But I think, but that's definitely one of the things to watch. Is that something that they can hold up and do that while still sort of managing the capacity in the way that Hapag and Maersk would want to do. But an interesting other aspect to kind of this new network setup.
Yeah, but do you think then, if we're now seeing, um, demand pick up and those box numbers are increasing from, certainly China into US, um, Gemini are gonna have to react quickly again, aren't they? And get the larger ships back onto those US-bound trades, and could there be a bit of kind of difficulty just realigning networks again? Or do you think that, maybe they've done it once, they're just doing it in reverse?
I almost want to say we're past that, because rates are already coming right down on certainly into the west coast from the far east. So there was a short period where they thought, okay, we want to add capacity here, but it lasted, what, 20 days, something like that, as we saw rates going up, and then that shifted. And of course, you have to first, you blanked all this capacity, or you lowered the capacity of the size of your ships, then you wanted to increase them, and now you want to go back to maybe a normal or lower. So things are moving so fast that it's hard to do that. But it's hard to do that for everybody at the moment, I think, regardless of whether you're blanking it or putting in smaller ship size. But that is, that's what I'm guessing, really,
Yeah.
is the plan for them going forward, and we'll see what happens if we get to some kind of peace, or if we just keep getting hit by more and more disruption.
Yeah, could they, I suppose, market conditions, or not even market conditions, operational conditions are gonna have a big impact on which alliance model works best, presumably. Because if Gemini are relying on this transshipment hub and spoke model, um, if we get port congestion, then are they more susceptible than other carriers that will just be kind of, sending the boxes straight to the port of choice for wherever the ship actually wants the boxes to be, you're increasing the legs of journeys that the boxes are
Yeah.
going through. So if we have a real issue like we had with transshipment in the immediacy following the Red Sea crisis, didn't we? That it was transshipment. It was in the Med, and I think Barcelona was
Yep.
hit, Singapore
Yeah.
hit.
And then in
Um,
Southeast Asia.
it's Southeast Asia. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if there is another incident that causes port congestion,
Yeah.
maybe would shippers be looking at and thinking Gemini are maybe a bit exposed?
I don't want to sound like I'm selling the product, but if I was in their shoes, I would say there's two answers to that. The first is that they have this control in the terminals. They have access to it in a way that they wouldn't if it was just somebody else's own terminal, and that should make a difference. They know ahead of time how many containers are on the ship, how much needs to be transshipped. That makes a big difference. And then secondly, they would say, I think, that by having more and more port calls, you're just adding. It's not like you're not calling at Singapore or other hubs, because the other alliances are still doing that. They're just doing that alongside others, and that just adds. If every port call adds a day's delay, that quickly adds up. If you're calling 5 ports in the Far East rather than 2, so they are of course very vulnerable to what happens in their hub ports. That's an issue, but you have a little bit less risk because you're not relying on that many more ports to be running smoothly for your service to kind of run along nicely.
Hmm. And just to be
Is
clear,
is what they would say, I believe. But
yeah, we are neutral.
yes,
We're not. We don't. This is. I haven't got a Gemini t-shirt underneath my Zanetta hoodie. We are, but we got to call it as it is, don't we? If they've said they want to achieve this level of reliability, and the data says that generally they are, well,
yeah, and I
that's
think
it, isn't it?
there's we've had so many years of poor reliability that to a certain extent you're thinking, this hasn't worked. Let's see if something else can do better. Your other alliances can say we believe direct port calls, and maybe things develop in that way, and actually that turns out to be the better option. But
Yeah,
it's worth giving it. I'm not saying it's worth putting your contain. You don't have as a shipper to say, okay, then I'm going to give them a chance. But I would say as an industry, it's worth seeing if there's another model that works better. Then we can decide a year or more down the road whether we want to pay extra for that or not. But I would say the shippers, specifically many of the ones we talk to, are this is a really big problem for them. And Gemini seems to be the only one saying, okay, we have a step by step plan of how we're going to improve that.
yeah, and it's interesting what shippers value, isn't it? Because we've seen during the tariffs, certainly, or in the wake of any disruption, um, we see the higher end of the market just start to lift off, don't we? And it's shippers saying, "I need to move my boxes. I'm willing to pay higher and higher," and that's why we get this kind of once it starts to spiral, it spirals and spirals and spirals because shippers are willing to pay, or not willing, have to pay higher freight rates to make sure that their goods get to wherever they need to be. So, in that sense, the cost of shipping, the reliability, or what you're paying for, the reliability is right up there, isn't it? It has to be fit, and certainly shippers with just-in-time supply chains or whatever it may be, there'll be all different motivations, won't there? But you can see why reliability is right at the middle of what's kind of keeping shippers awake at night.
And we talk a lot about indexing usually, and we haven't done so much today, but that's also one of the things. If you're not spending so much time backing and forthing on the rate and figuring out the rate goes up, then you can focus on some other stuff. You can focus on transit times and reliability and kind of build that into the contract that you have some form of guarantees or penalties if there's not met. So it's definitely we've said I don't know how many times over the past many years that it's about more than just your freight rate. And schedule reliability is often one of the top things on that list when you say the price is great, but I also need other assurances.
Yeah.
Reliability is definitely along the top there.
If you don't have the data, so you've just talked about the reliability hitting 80% or whatever it is with Gemini. If you don't have the data, your perception, your reality is whatever experience you have of those containers being moved. And I did hear one shipper um, saying that he ran a tender and he discounted one carrier because he didn't think that that carrier provided a very good service and his experience has always been bad. And actually, when he looked at the data, that carrier, they weren't the best, but actually, in terms of reliability, they were, you know, better than Joe. There's two realities here, isn't there? There's the reality of what that ship is actually experiencing and the reality of what the data's actually telling us. And without that data, maybe you can go down blind alleys, maybe.
I think it's definitely good to have both. I don't think you as a shipper should discount your experience because, as I said, reliability, it's these deep sea lakes. So if you are wanting to go to Oslo, then of course your experience of actually getting a container to Oslo is just as important, if not more so, than what the data is showing you on a global level. But you certainly shouldn't say, I mean, the more data you can get, the better, and you can kind of look and see if we have alternatives, especially as things keep changing. That maybe something that was right a year ago is not right anymore. And for that, you need to be able to track things.
I go. So just to round this episode off, we're going to be, well, people have been kind of delaying tenders and such like because of the spike in freight rates, and there's kind of waiting for them to come down and maybe ever get some stability back in the market. Probably not, but that's what people are waiting for. With that being said, this is another thing. We've talked about the next kind of tender season coming up, the next long-term contract negotiations coming up for shippers for the next 12-month contract when they're negotiating later this year. And we talked about the freight rate issue being something that's really going to kind of make those negotiations particularly spicy. But we haven't talked about this dynamic, have we? Where a shipper can say, yeah, but Gemini can give me 90% reliability. What can you do? It's another thing that a shipper is going to be going into negotiations with, they're kind of holding their playing cards, thinking that's something I can say to whatever, Ocean or whoever. It's not just price, as you say. They're going to
No,
start
and
playing cards
it's
off against each other.
the other thing we say often is there's no one solution that fits everybody. So every shipper has also to look at its network and say, okay, am I willing to pay a little bit more to go with Gemini? Can I reliably make that assumption that I can lower those costs? So all of it, some people may be ready to do that from October if we get another 4 months of good data and they're looking for the 2026 rates, and others will say no, not yet. And whether Gemini and Maersk and Hapag can get higher rates will depend on how many people are willing to shift and at what stage. I very much doubt it is at the end of this year, but maybe the first will start moving. And it also depends on what the situation is. Do you think we're going to go back to normal and congestion and all that kind of stuff isn't going to be a problem? Are you willing to bet on that? Or are you going to be a little bit more cautious and see how it comes? And we can't answer that because it depends entirely on your supply chain.
Yeah.
And what it looks like.
Wonderful. Well, let's round off this freight debate where we've tackled reliability. If Kenny Scotter and Rolf Habben Jansen do fancy coming on and being grilled by Emily on their reliability.
I was not there. I don't do the grilling. I was just sitting and figuring out how it all worked. So.
Yeah, they're more than welcome though.
Fine by me. Absolutely.
They're more than welcome. Thank you, Emily. I think that was a incredibly interesting discussion and debate. If you agree and you would like to hear and watch more freight debates, please like and subscribe. If you're interested, please join us again.